Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hello, Corey. Good day and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. We're such huge fans of your work, and we're really excited to hear you talk about negative emotions today in the context of happiness. But before we jump in, could you please share a little bit about yourself with our listeners, about your work, your passion, and why you decided to join us?
Sure. At the moment, I'm in the middle of a PhD that's based on looking at some of the deeper causes of anxiety and depression. And we're specifically interested in, say, how attention training and mindfulness kind of sort of training can actually improve those causes. So we're interested in anxiety and depression by looking at deeper causes. And the types of training we're using for that mindfulness training is actually was taken straight out of a Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which is based on my previous sort of work where I did a lot of translating from Tibetan to English. So I lived in India up in the Himalayas for a long time and studied a lot of Buddhist philosophy, came back to Australia, did a psychology degree and a Sanskrit degree at the same time. And now we're sort of putting all that together to find out how those types of practices might help us. We can talk about the benefits of those practices using a psychology, a vocabulary, if you like. So that's sort of mostly what I'm doing. And then the coaching and that sort of work I do with all sorts of people, but I do tend to work with teachers or healthcare professionals. Anyone whose emotional state impacts the emotional state of multiple others is kind of really big on my radar. So that's sort of what we're working towards.
Wow, that's amazing. It sounds like you've been around quite a bit. So you have a lot of wonderful insights to share with us today. And this topic in particular is quite an interesting one because it touched on something that has the word negative in it. It's not positive psychology. It actually we're talking about negative emotions. So there's probably quite a bit to unpack. And before we go into the other sections of this podcast, we would love to hear your definition about this topic. How do you define negative emotions?
Okay, so this is going to, I hope this doesn't torpedo the rest of it. So from the perspective that I work from, which is based in an appraisal models of emotions, mostly the work of Paul Ekman, who's a very, very famous emotions researcher. From the perspective we're standing at is actually, we kind of don't accept that there are negative emotions. So and the reason is this: if you think about something that's negative, then it's something you need to get rid of. So if I have some negative something, you sort of want to get rid of it because it's harmful. Whereas it's not the case. And in fact, what has happened, and this is just my kind of opinion, is that what psychology and what our culture has done is taken what we call negative affect, which is an unpleasant experience, and we've taken that experience and labeled it with the emotion. So then you get this idea, sure, anger, it does not feel good, of course. Fear doesn't feel good, sadness as well. These are negative affect. But to call fear a negative emotion is really problematic because we can't survive without fear. The sorts of emotional reactions we have save our lives, and they have for thousands of generations. So I think it's a real problem to start talking about negative emotions as opposed to sort of destructive emotions works well, or problematic or negative affect. All these sorts of things work quite well. But to talk about the emotions themselves as negative gives people this idea, and I come across this in my work, of I need to just not experience fear. I need to not be sad. I need to not have this anxiety and stress, which is completely hopeless. You'll never go without those emotions. So when I talk about overcoming negative emotions, I sort of often joke I can do it in 30 seconds because there aren't any, and you're welcome. But it doesn't solve the problem of what about now when our emotions are out of balance, and this becomes really interesting now. What
Yeah.
are emotions themselves for? And ideally, emotions are really signposts. And we have an emotional reaction because there's something happening that we believe is important, and we respond. And so it becomes an issue. Am I overestimating the problem? Am I overreacting? These are really interesting questions, especially in terms of anxiety and sadness and negative affect. But to label it as a negative emotion is problematic, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way that we look at negative emotions constantly changes over time. And at least a lot more people are open minded about it now. But in the past, they were labeled as something that's really, really bad and you need to avoid it at all costs. But like you
Yeah,
were saying, like, it's just impossible because we were starting out as creatures with fear, and that drives us to create all these things surrounding our lives. And I feel like that is something that we will probably dig a little bit deeper when we go into the episode. But before we do
sure.
that, we have a really fun activity for you. We
Okay.
would love to do a thing called rapid fire questions with you. And we would love to hear the first thing that pops into your mind when you hear these words. So, are you ready?
Yes, sure.
All right. What is a recent or a favorite book you've read?
Uh, Lost Connections by Johann Hari.
Oh, I've heard so much about it. I really want to read it. So definitely on my list. Love
Important
that.
book.
Yeah. What is a recent or a favorite movie you've watched?
A favorite movie. Actually, I'd have to say there's a movie called Kundun. It's by Martin Scorsese. It's from the 90s that runs through sort of the Dalai Lama's life. And it sparked my interest. I just went to the movies and it sparked my interest enough that it drove me, to
Yeah.
drop what I was doing and actually go to India. So I would say
Wow.
that's an important film for me.
Yeah.
And of course, it's Martin Scorsese. It's a well-made film.
Yeah. Seems life changing for you watching that movie.
Indirectly, certainly, yeah, it had a big influence. Hmm.
Yeah. What is a recent or a favorite podcast you've listened to? Not this
Oh,
one.
haha. That's easy. The Your Undivided Attention from Tristan Harris at the Center for Humane Technology.
Oh, how that's interesting. What's that about?
I don't know if there's been a big documentary recently called The Social Dilemma, and so it's Tristan Harris, and I'll get this a bit wrong, but there's a group of them who left Facebook and Twitter and these sorts of big tech giants because they started to see the harm that they were actually doing, which they hadn't done on purpose, and they've set up sort of an organization which helps kind of rethink the business model around social media and so on, and they're having a big impact. It's well worth the time.
Yeah, amazing. So you mentioned a documentary. This one is actually about documentary. Any other documentary aside from The Social Dilemma you like?
Um, I'd say any of those, the Blue Planet series by David Attenborough.
Yes, I
I
love that
mean,
series.
yeah,
Our Planet or
is
Blue Planet?
Blue Planet.
Oh, okay. Maybe that's a different series from the one that I know.
Oh,
Ah,
yeah. Or
interesting.
maybe it's been so long since I've seen it, I've got it wrong.
Yeah, because my favorite docu-series is Our Planet by David as well. So I think there
I'm gonna
might
have to
be
look it up.
either another series or the same series. So yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Next one is famous role model.
I'd have to say recently, especially with recent events, Desmond Tutu. I can remember from such a young age watching all the trouble in South Africa, and he was even as a young child. I'm old enough to have been a young child then. Seeing him on the news and actually really resonating with him somehow, and I actually managed to see him speak with the Dalai Lama when I was in India. He came to visit, and they gave a talk, which was really nice. So it's easy answer that one, Desmond Tutu.
Yeah, fantastic. What is a favorite app that you use?
um, Swellnet, probably the Surf Report. That would
Oh,
be it.
okay. Interesting. I've never heard of it. Next one. What is your favorite news website?
The ABC
Yeah.
mostly. I do check on Al Jazeera. I like to get a really different kind of point, but
Mm,
ABC for sure.
yeah. All right. Who is your favorite artist?
So my first degree was a music performance
Oh,
degree,
there you go.
and so Herbie Hancock again, easy answer.
Yeah. Wow. That comes easy to you for sure. All right. Semi last. What is a recent or a favorite course you have completed?
I'd say the favorite course um, would be I did a teacher training course for a program that's called Cultivating Emotional Balance that combines meditation with psychology. And I've taught that course quite a lot over the last maybe 10 years or more. But that sparked my interest and sent me back to uni to get the psych degree and continue research. So for sure, that teacher training was pretty seminal for me. Yeah.
Yep. Perfect. And finally, what is a recent event or favorite event you have attended?
I've been many events lately. My favorite event would be, it's easy, in 2014, I think, I went back to India with a tour guide friend of mine and working for her, and I was leading Q&A sessions for a group who'd gone over to a big event that the Dalai Lama was putting on, actually. And so it's up in Ladakh, so right on the Tibetan border. It's quite remote and very, very high. And there were over 100,000 people at this event. There were about 4,000 foreigners. They were mostly locals. And it was quite incredible to have so many people. And it was the calmest, most really sort of peaceful outside under these mountains. So Kala Chakra, it's called, back in Ladakh in, I think, 2014. Easy.
Wow. Yeah. What an event to remember. All right. So that concludes our rapid fire questions. And I really
Okay.
loved your answers so far. I'll definitely look into some of the things that you recommended.
Sure.
And now we are going to go and talk about our practice, your practice, your habit when it comes to the topic of the day.
Yeah.
So, the first question that we have for you is what is the practice that you do to deal with your negative emotions?
Sure. So because I've just got and said there aren't any. So like, but problematic emotional reactions.
Yeah.
We can all understand that.
Yeah.
For sure, there is a, how to say it. I would say that I have a strong mindfulness training background through my Buddhist background, of course. So a strong mindfulness training. I would say that's the most important part. But it's not. You need more than that. But that is certain. You can't do anything without that. So I would have to say that the mindfulness practice that I do is for sure the most important.
Yeah. I've heard so much about mindfulness and yeah, I've been trying my best to doing my best to practice it in my life as well. So I totally hear you and would love to hear some more about that. So what are the three good things about this practice?
Um, I would say, firstly, the sense of relaxation that comes from it. So and of course you've got to be clear. There's lots of different types and idea of mindfulness and ideas about what mindfulness is. So I have a very specific one that I've studied and stick with. But I would say certainly the sort of relaxation, uh, also the kind of clarity that comes from it. Yeah, so we've got three things. So relaxation, clarity, and I would say the third of those is actually that the spillover effect you get in your daily life. So of course there are training sessions that I do, but that you get that clarity and relaxation for free in the rest of your life, just from based on the amount of time you spend doing
Yeah.
the actual training.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I agree with that because I've been feeling the same when I practice mindfulness as well. It's definitely not easy for me personally. Especially when we live in such a stimulating world right now, and there's just a lot happening. So, in your opinion, what are some of the challenges when you practice mindfulness?
Um, I would say even after all this time, and I first learned to meditate in, I think, when I moved to Canada in the 90s, let's say. So it was a long time ago. So I've been at it for a long time. And I'm still surprised sometimes for myself, like everyone, I get busy, is how much I sort of think I need to do the deadlines I need to meet and the things I need to do are more important than the practice. And I'm really surprised at myself even now that sometimes I fall into that trap, even though I know that I will make the deadlines better and earlier and more with more clarity and better if I do the practice for the sake of the amount of time. But nonetheless, you put me under enough pressure, and I feel as if I shouldn't be on the cushion. I should be at my desk. And so that for me, that's one of the big challenges is noticing that and reversing it and saying, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
You got to go do the practice. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like a little bit of a the combination of procrastination and also like as I mentioned earlier, the stimulating environments that we're in, constant deadline notifications and stuff like that. So it's probably one of the things that would stop us or challenge us when we practice mindfulness. So that's great to know.
Yeah.
And because it is so challenging, I would reckon you make time for it. So, how often do you practice it?
Um, yeah, so I already have a series of practices that I've been taught and kind of committed to. So you know, of course, when I lived in India and I speak Tibetan, so I had a lot of access to teachers because I could speak the language. So I have some practices that I've promised these teachers that I'll do every day. So from that, it's kind of like, oh, I've told them I'll do it. So whereas if I committed to doing it myself, I'd probably just let it slide sometimes. But I do have these practices because I've sort of promised someone else, then I'm more likely to do it. There's varied practices, but all of them contain a mindfulness element. So I would spend, minimum 30 minutes, anywhere from half an hour to 3 hours a day, probably. Unless I get retreat time. If I really get time out and take off into retreat, then of course you can ramp it up to 8, 9, 10 hours even. Um, but that doesn't even happen every year for me these days.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
half an hour. And actually, having said all that, I often say to people, and this is in my observations of teaching and running these programs, is that 15 minutes a day is plenty. That's a good amount to notice a difference within 7, 10, 14 days. You'll start to notice. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's all it takes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's consistency.
Yeah.
So you said that you would spend anywhere between 30 minutes to 3 hours. Are they in the morning, in the afternoon? How do you make time for it in your busy daily schedule?
Yeah, I try to do it first thing. So maybe I get up and have a drink of water, move around a little, but I try to do it first thing, and certainly before I turn my phone on and see what's going on there. So there's a session there, and when I say 3 hours, that would be several sessions. So there'd be half hour in the morning, um, certainly be another half hour in the afternoon or the evening. Maybe not right before bed. But I'm not too strict on it, and then I'll chop it up during the day. I'm quite fortunate working from home, so I have a whole room dedicated to meditation next to me, but I also have a mat and a cushion on the floor here. And when I'm trying to sift through data or do things I'm not very good at that stress me out, I will stop and just drop down and set a timer for even just 20, 30 minutes and take that
Yeah.
time out and get back to it. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I try first thing before your phone is turned on for sure and I'd recommend that across the board for everyone.
Yeah.
Um,
I
and then
agree.
it's what some people are night people. I'm a morning person, change around. But for me, morning bookends with these little sessions during the day.
Yeah. I think that's such a great tip and, so great, especially if other people and most people are still working from home. So it would be
Yeah,
really great to learn from you and maybe set up a little Zen zone next to them or away from their desk. And they can do that as well because, the practice is important when you have the right space for it. So that's really great. Sounds like we have
actually,
a
just
proper
on that,
setup there.
Lou, it's a really good point actually that um, in there's a lot of really interesting research on locations. So that you're physically affected by a location. So if you constantly meditate somewhere, just going into that place will actually calm you down.
Yeah.
And so actually, if you do set up, that's why I have the cushion in my office. Because although I do most of the formal stuff in this room that I've put aside for it, I try to make sure this is also a space where I relax when I come into. So it can be helpful. The Zen, what did you call it? Zen
Zen
space?
zone.
Zen zone? Yeah, yeah. Like, this is a
Yeah.
nice idea, especially if it's in a place that you are under pressure sometimes. That'll
Yeah.
really help even things out.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I have a little Zen zone in my apartment as well, and I feel like whenever I work from home, if I'm stressed out, that's where I'm gonna go. And like
Right.
you were saying, yeah, like whenever I go to the Zen zone, I feel calm instantly. It's so great. So yeah, I totally agree with you. Great tips for everybody. Now, you said that you would chop it up into multiple sessions in a day, which is really great to hear. Obviously, you're working from home, so it's a bit different. Um, and it's kind of hard nowadays because we are constantly working from home. It's kind of like we switch from one device to another because we need to communicate with our colleagues or, go and search for things, do our research. So how do you make time for it? Because if you have a really busy packed day, how are you going to chop that up in between?
So how do I? Sorry, I just lost you there. But how do we make time for it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
especially during the day.
Um, so I do have this luxury where I'm quite busy and I have a lot to do, but my time's quite flexible. So yeah, I'm aware of that. It's quite a luxury. Um, I so let me just talk about perhaps a more general, more common situation. I would
Yeah.
narrow that down to like um, you need to notice. So you need to notice, say, am I reading the same thing over and over and not getting it, or am I extra distracted? Am I being pulled out at the window, or these sorts of things? And just pull a 5 minute session out. It's like just break that up and spend 5 minutes
Yeah.
and come back. This is sort of how I would suggest, because that's what happens to me is I notice I'm doing the same thing over and over, or I've written one thing and decided it was wrong and corrected it and then recorrected it. And I think, oh, look, just for the sake of, for me, for the sake of 10, 15 minutes even, I could save myself an hour probably. So it becomes, for me, after it's been enough time, there is this sense for me that it's like, oh, it's not so much that um, it's like, oh, I can see things aren't working, and I actually know the answer is to just take this break and sort of release all this stuff. And so I go and do it. But that, as I said at the beginning, sometimes that's very intellectual. It's like, even though I know that's true, I don't feel like I should. I feel like I should stay here and finish it off. And so it does take a bit of kind of experience, I guess, so that my experience tells me that even though I think I should, even though I feel as if I should just stay here and keep pushing harder, I actually know that I'll get more benefit by moving away for a bit. And so over time, it just becomes more and more reflex. It's like, oh, I'm all distracted and not getting anywhere. So the cushion kind of draws me over.
Yeah. I totally agree with that actually, because when you said you read the same thing over and over and you just don't get it, I'm
Yeah.
like, I have definitely been there.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, whenever that happens, I'm just like, okay, I need to take a break. So I
Yeah.
think that is the equivalent of the mindfulness session that you were talking about. So perhaps the breaks could be, I would probably redesign the breaks so they are more like mindfulness sessions of practice. It will be really good so that I feel like it's kind of like restart your brain somehow, because
Yeah.
how you restart your computer when it's not working. I feel like that would help restart or jumpstart your brain again so that you can actually take in whatever you're reading, or do the task that you're doing much better than just trying to just type away at your desk and not taking a break.
It absolutely does. And actually, there's um, another way I often recommend to clients of mine, and this works really well, is to set a timer for how long you're going to work. And so that could, maybe even if it's only half an hour, so you set a 30-minute timer and you work. And people find they don't have trouble doing that because they know it's going to end. So they get through the 30 minutes. And no matter what's going on for you at that 30 minutes, stop and do this 5 minute session. So I'd give them a guided session at first of me, but
Yeah.
eventually they could do it on their own.
Oh,
and
that's
and
amazing.
so yeah, so what happens then is you get this 30 minutes of work and a 5 minute break, and then that trains people actually, and of course you extend it to 35 minutes of work and more and more, and that really helps. Actually, that can be a really great way. And I do it when if I've got like stuff from work and stuff from the PhD and all these things coming at me. I'll do that to myself. I'll put a 35-minute work timer on, and I'll take 10 minutes out. And so when that goes off, and then then once I've got the momentum, I stop doing it. But it's a great way if you think you're under pressure and struggling. It's really helpful to get these real blocks of time in, and they're not sort of interspersed with things that actually increase your distraction, like scrolling through your phone or doing these sorts of things. You're actually breaking it up by something that's only going to make your work more efficient when you sit back down. And you do that. People do that for a week, and the results are it's really easy to get results for people with that sort of approach.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds amazing. I think I'll definitely take that up. And I know we've touched on lots of benefits of the practice, but how do you think this practice would impact your happiness or perception in your life?
Yeah. Um, the the So of course it improves it. It's easy to say. It
Yeah.
improves your sense of
Absolutely.
well-being, if you like. How it does that's really um, scientifically. There's a lot of research going on about it, and I'm part of that movement trying to define it scientifically. And there are some interesting results. There's some conflicting results too. For me, that's when I get interested and I flip back over to the contemplative side and I look at what have people been saying for a couple of thousand years about why it helps. And that sort of, this is how you try to meld the two, this science and contemplative approach that myself and many others are working on. And when you look back over certainly the tradition I work with, one of the reasons we'd say that it works is because of, how to say, the question we often ask is this. I hear it all the time. What do I need to do to be more relaxed? What do I need to do to pay attention better? What do I need to do to be happier? The question perhaps that would be easier to fix and have more bang for your buck is, what do I need to stop doing to be more relaxed? What do I need to stop doing to be more efficient? What do I need to stop doing to be happier? It's a much more interesting question.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
so once this, and I don't want to say properly, but there's an array of different mindfulness traditions, and the one that I belong to really takes this approach. It's like, well, let's see what happens when you stop chasing after every single thought and idea and memory and worry that pops up in your mind. Let's see what happens. And what people will find is they start to feel relaxed, and they start to feel quite good, and then they feel better and better. And that feeling comes from, or that sort of improved happiness and well-being comes from an ability to actually do less, being still. And that really doesn't gel with our society. Like, our culture is about doing, doing, doing. And so, yeah, for me, this is one of my biggest challenges with clients. Is like, just, do nothing. So I can't do, if I do nothing, I'm not contributing. And I sort of respond and say, you can't do nothing. So let's see, try and do nothing and see how good you are at it. It's hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So it seems like this practice really ties into improving your quality of life in general when people can start incorporating it into their daily lives. And, that in turn means that the level of happiness will increase because even though we were talking about, how you deal with negative emotions, it's not like you only apply this practice when negative emotions arise, but it's more like you're practicing mindfulness every day so that you're just better prepared and equipped to deal with it. Hence, you're happier. The level of happiness is more stable.
That's exactly right. Is you get, it's twofold in a way. You get the mindfulness actual training sessions. You start to notice, wow, when I just sit and relax and just rest and stop doing things, like stop chasing after all these thoughts and whatever, and leave them alone, I feel quite content. So that's kind of cool. That's helpful. That spills over, because of course, I mean, this word is meditation, right? You look in certainly Tibetan language, in Sanskrit and Pali, these sort of, for me, they're source languages, like in terms of Buddhism. The word that we translate as meditation translates much better as cultivation or familiarization, is really what it means. So what you're doing is you're cultivating that sense of sort of innate well-being. You're cultivating or familiarizing yourself with being still rather than being in motion all the time. And if you cultivate that on the cushion, you get it for free in the outside world. So that's kind of where we're at with the whole thing, I guess, that just as you would, I don't know, just as you would exercise, go to the gym or run or something, so you'd be fit everywhere, so to you do the meditation and cultivate this mindfulness so that you get the benefits of it everywhere, as you say, not just when you're under the influence of emotions.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. It's just really good to keep that in mind because you always need to be prepared rather than be reactive to the situations. So, this practice of mindfulness is such a great practice that you're talking about in the context of negative emotions because it's not like we are only doing this when we feel like negative emotions arise. It seems to me that you're going ahead of the curve and you're preparing for it and getting ready so that whenever there's anything that happens, whenever you feel negative emotions, you're already well prepared and you're already at that stage where you can manage whatever happens. And then, in essence, that affects your level of happiness. So then, your level of happiness is always stable. Um, so, how do you think this practice would improve your level of happiness or perception in life?
So yeah, this is an important question that, because it has to be answered in sort of a couple of sort of ways, I guess. Firstly, look at this actual, mindfulness training. Because the words I use, really, what we're talking about is a type of meditation. So it's good to start there. If you look back and see, for what I call source languages, so things like Tibetan language, Sanskrit, and Pali, then, which is what I did a lot of my study in those languages, then what you'll find is that the word we translate as meditation, and to be clear, as an interpreter and translator, I translate it as meditation, but it translates much more accurately as cultivation or familiarization, something like this. And so when we talk about meditating on things, for example, meditating on the breath and this sort of stuff, it's a very clumsy way of speaking. In these languages, they talk about cultivating your mindfulness or familiarizing with, compassion, kindness, these other things that you would use in meditation. And so so the first thing you'll find is that by doing this type of training, then people become they tap into a source of well-being that was sort of previously unavailable to them. And one of the reasons for this is that the question that we often ask, and I hear this all the time from, my clients and so on, and people come to me saying, what do I need to do? This is how they start, right? What do I need to do to be more relaxed? What do I need to do to be more efficient? What do I need to do to be happier? This is what we get. And perhaps a more powerful question and a more important question would be, what do I need to stop doing, right, to be more relaxed? What could I stop doing to be more efficient? What could I stop doing to be happier? These are much more important questions. And then this brings into how the mindfulness training works. And so, of course, when you look at how does it do what it does, or how does it affect your perception or make you happier, and so on? There's a lot of scientific activity looking into that, and there's conflicting results, but they were coming along. Certainly, that's my research falls in there as well. But we can flip over to the contemplative side of things and look over there and see what they're saying, and they're much more talking about this, what do I need to stop doing way of thinking. And so in a mindfulness training session, so you're in this meditation session where you're cultivating mindfulness, right, or familiarizing with mindfulness, it becomes very much about what you're not doing. And what you're not doing is chasing after every single little thought, idea, memory, and latching onto it and having it take you for a ride. You're just staying put and focusing on this one thing while the circus of the mind goes on over here, and you're just kind of ignoring it as best you can. Of course, you keep getting pulled back and forth. And so then what people find after a little bit of training is that it's really pleasant. Just being still, being aware like this is actually surprisingly pleasant, and there's this sense of well-being that comes from it. And because you're cultivating it and familiarizing yourself with that well-being that comes from just being still and attentive and clear, what you get is that for free, is that it spills over into the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And so the first one is the meditation session. Then you've got, as you said, well, how does it work in the outside world? It's not like, there's intense emotion arising, I need to find my cushion and pull out a cushion and sit down.
Exactly.
But because you don't need to, you that stuff is spilling over for free, and that reactivity is going to be dialed down, and not just from a physical level, but from a mental level from the practice.
Yeah.
And and I guess this is where it's really important to say that from certainly in the circles I move in and the tradition I belong to, mindfulness in and of itself it's essential, but it's not enough. It sort of makes you inert. It just makes you. I could stop causing a lot of harm through mindfulness by just shutting up when I get emotional, right? But but the whole purpose, and certainly in these ancient traditions, the whole purpose of the mindfulness training is to use it. And so then you use it. And so, for example, if you team that up with, or you pair it with some emotional literacy is the term I would use, understanding how emotions work and what they're for, things like there are no negative emotions, but emotions are signposts that something important is happening. Then what the mindfulness training should give you in the outside world, and you don't have to try it, you should just habitually start to think, like I'm emotional. It's like, what's that about? What should I do now? What's the most constructive thing I can do now? And so you've got these two things. You've got the emotional literacy and you've got the mindfulness training. With just mindfulness training, then you sort of just become a bit of a dead weight. You can just stay put, which is life-changing for people. I mean, it's helpful. Or you could train people in emotions, right? Which is great. Then they'd understand how emotions work, but they won't have access to that information when they're emotional, because they're emotional. But when you put the two together, then what you get is the ability to reduce or increase your reaction time. You stay more relaxed, you get that calm, and then you really understand what's happening, right? So instead of being hit from behind by the freight train of an emotion and just sort of being pinned to it as it runs, through the tracks, you actually you've got this signpost that says, hey, something important's happening. What do you think's the best thing to do now? And then now that I've got this far, I'll just go one step further. If you combine that again with, say, kindness and compassion training, which again, there's thousands of years of evidence for this, then you can cultivate kindness and compassion in such a way that your response is driven by that. So you've got the attentive, clear, relaxed mindfulness, which understands what's happening because it understands emotions, and the whole thing's available. And then while that's going on, also, your natural habitual response is to kind of do the best for the people around you and yourself. Look for constructive outcomes. So your question was about how does the mindfulness training help, and it helps only so much. But when you combine it with these other things, then it stops being a survival mechanism that can keep you sort of hold still and turn into actual formula for reaching above average, higher levels of well-being. In the same way an athlete can train and get physically fit, then we can train and become get above average mental health as well.
Yeah, that's really amazing because you already covered like the other questions that we really wanted to touch on, which was what could we combine with mindfulness to
Yeah,
improve our
sure.
happiness? And this, pretty much covers that. And the other thing that stood out to me as well was really the emphasis on how this is not a coping mechanism, but it's more like the tools, and you get prepared and you build that into your daily habit, and you do all these different things, including mindfulness, so that whenever negative emotions arise, whenever there's a situation that you need to react to, maybe you don't even need to react to it, but your reactions would then be moderated and you feel more at peace, calmer. And to me, in turns, that brings you to be a little bit happier as well.
Yeah,
So,
you're getting positive
yeah,
outcomes right now because
yeah,
your reactions are not driven. The thing about emotions, to sort of, it's really important to understand. Emotions have evolved in such a way that they fix short-term problems. They're a short-term fix. They narrow our focus down and they reorient the world. So when I'm emotional, the whole world just reorients itself to be about me. It's not about you. It's not about anybody else. It's about me. Whether it's fear, happiness, enjoyable emotions, doesn't matter. And so that can be problematic if if you've got this idea of I've got these overarching goals where I want to be consistently happy and well, but then I'm coming up with obstacles and my emotions are driving me into automatic reactions that are in conflict actually with my broader goals. And the only way to sort of get those two to align is to have the sort of attention skills to be focused on your broader goal even when you're emotional. And then you add to that, this other training in kindness, compassion, so on, and that sort of motivates your reaction.
yeah, absolutely. Well, that's amazing. It's definitely a full package if you apply all these practices and combine them. So the last question we want to ask you in this segment is who would you recommend this practice to? Would you recommend it to everyone or a certain age group? What are your thoughts on this?
It is a really important question that I don't think anyone has a definitive answer for. I can tell you in my experience. So I don't really deal with people younger than, say, 18 or 20 realistically. I come from a family of teachers, like my brother, my sister-in-law, my wife, both my parents. Uh, and so, the expertise in other parts of the family, I don't really know.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with, let's just say, adults, to me, I've really paid attention to this, that it's important to get clear instruction, understand like how to do the training, why it would work. I think is really important to understand why it works, and then how to measure it. Like, so how to see if your meditation sessions are getting better, and most importantly, if your emotions are getting better in the outside world. And to me, I think the most important aspect of that is, do the people who are training, can they understand the instructions? Can they and implement them, right? And if people can, then they tend to get results. And the reason I say it this way is because there are a lot of people have come to me with, even quite debilitating sort of mental illness, anxiety, depression, even schizophrenia. Although I've got to be honest, they didn't tell me they had a schizophrenic diagnosis to begin with. But the point is that it's a mental illness in this way doesn't affect your intelligence. Plenty of super intelligent people, have depression or anxiety. But if they can understand what they should expect and how they should do it, then to me that's the kind of litmus test
Yeah.
So if people are just thinking that it's some mystical thing that I just sit here and magically get better, then they're probably going to struggle. But if someone sits down and says, actually, I just need to do this, I understand this, that, like the components,
Yeah.
then they should be all right, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's safe to say that anyone would benefit from this. Obviously, from younger than 18, you don't really have much experience of dealing with
Yeah.
younger people, but overall, it's definitely something that everyone could benefit from.
I believe so, because there are some fundamentals here that are the same for all humans.
Yeah.
And interestingly, one of them is emotions. So there's a lot of research into this, that our physiological and the way emotions work, whether you're from Mozambique or Paris or Toronto or Bangkok, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
They all work the same. And then the other side of that is attention and distraction. We only have sort of two types of attention, just to oversimplify it. We basically have a type of attention that's under our control. It's called an endogenous attention system. It's got its own neural system. Or we've got attention that's being pulled away from us. We call it, which is an exogenous attention system. And neurologically, we switch between the two.
Yeah.
And so that's the same for everyone. So if you could sort of start, it doesn't matter who you are, if you start to understand that I want to cultivate this considered, controlled attention, right? And then I also want to understand how my emotions work, then unless you have some serious emotional problems or mental distress,
Yeah.
then as you say, it should sort of just work for almost
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's amazing. I think, yeah, definitely agree with you because at least for me, it was this foreign thing that was never really adopted or talked about in my community when I was in my early 20s. And then I realized that, oh, everyone started talking about it more and more
Yeah.
as the years unfolded. And then now we know that it's so beneficial. And then you can combine it with a lot of other things you do on a daily basis because it's not something that you do when you go through distress. It's actually something you do so that you deal better with
Yeah.
negative emotions. So there we have it. Everyone could benefit from this. And that's our conclusion. So thank you for sharing about the practice of mindfulness. And now the exciting part is we get to talk about negative emotions in the context of happiness. So we dig deeper into the topic of the day. So we already touched on a little bit about negative emotions, but in the context of the podcast, we talk a lot about happiness, and each person has a really different definition of happiness. So to you, what is happiness?
So having already kind of torpedoed the whole idea of negative emotions, then I'll give you um, a really old version of happiness that works for me. So it's been around thousands of years, and which is I find interesting because there's a lot of scientific activity into happiness. There's been philosophical inquiry for thousands of years. The ancient Greeks were trying to figure it out, and there's never been any consensus. So here's one that I've been using for quite some time, and we talk about happiness as there being two types. Okay, so we call it hedonic. So which we can define very clearly. A hedonic happiness is happiness derived from what you get from the world. Okay, so I live in Queensland. I often call it resource-driven happiness. Like you sort of you need something to drive it. And then there's another type which we call genuine happiness, or there's this Greek word called eudaimonia, which shows up in positive psychology nowadays quite a lot. And we define that very simply as a happiness or well-being derived from what you bring to the world. And this is a remarkably uncontroversial. I've sort of presented this for a long time all over the country. It's remarkably uncontroversial, and it's really clear because there's no other type. Like there's no other type of once you've got those two, it's not like there's a third type. So you've got this division. Then, to be clear though, our sort of Western minds especially like to divide things up into good or bad. And these aren't good or bad
Yeah.
types of happiness. So a hedonic, if I'm hungry and I have food, if it's raining and I have an umbrella, if it's cold and I have a jacket, these are all totally hedonic. They're resource driven. So it's what you need is to look into what sources of hedonic well-being do I need, and how can I put what I've got into sort of the service of the genuine. And so there becomes a balance of two types of well-being that we use, and in order to sort of come up with this overall global scale, if you like, of happiness or well-being is kind of a better word. Happiness is problematic because is that the happiness I get when my dog sits, when I ask her to sit, or when someone gives me a coffee? Or is it the happiness of knowing that I'm working on something that I know is going to be beneficial and I'm excited about the research we're doing, but it won't be published for a while? Um, and so, it's hard, isn't it? Because they're independent. Because I can be excited about the research I'm doing, and then my dog runs off and I'm kind of angry. So or vice versa. I can feel like I've got no real direction in life and be feeling miserable, but have a really good meal and feel good about it. They're not they move independently. And so it makes more sense to me to talk about it in this way of hedonic versus genuine happiness, not as good or bad. And in fact, if I just push on for one more second, the only way these two get us into trouble, and they get us into a lot of trouble, is when we mistake the hedonic for the genuine. Other than that, hedonic in and of itself isn't a problem, as long as you don't have this expectation that's going to have this long-term payoff.
Yeah. Okay. So 2 types, hedonic, genuine. And to you then, how do you package that in your own life? Do you kind of categorize them based on, when I, need something, I then look for my happiness as, hedonic happiness. And then when I don't really feel the need for resource driven happiness, I go and turn to genuine happiness. How does it work in your life?
Sure. That's a really good question. In a nutshell, it sort of works, I guess, in a way. In fact, I've never been asked this question, so I'm trying to think the clearest way to say it. It's like there's a certain amount of the hedonic resources I need. I need to pay my mortgage. I need to buy groceries. The dog I mentioned is a bit sick. I need to make sure she has medicine and so on. And so I need to do what it takes to get all that. But then I do have these other resources. I do have a bit of time. Like, I'm busy, but I can find time. So then it comes down to this idea of what are the causes. There's this conference down in Sydney every year that's up and running again. It's called Happiness and Its Causes Conference.
Yeah.
Which is very deliberately
Very
chosen.
interesting. Yeah.
Because there's what causes it. Well, we sort of know what causes hedonic happiness. So let's have a look at what causes genuine happiness and how can I implement it, which is what you're asking, how does this work for me? And so there are traditionally, so from a Buddhist perspective, there's a few things, but you could say there are 5 particular things that really drive this genuine well-being. One is we call equanimity. Let's go this direction. 1, kindness and compassion are 2. Then we have what we call equanimity, and equanimity is the sort of sense that can send that kindness and compassion out beyond the people that it's easy to have compassion for.
Yeah.
So, out to people I don't really know or people I don't even like. So there's this ability to sort of send it out. So you got kindness, compassion, equanimity, and then we call it empathic joy, which is this is a really, for me, interesting marrying of contemplative and science approaches. Is it really controls for our human negativity bias by sitting down and actually thinking about things that I've done well, times I've helped other people, inspiring things I've seen other people do, things that don't make the news, and that my negativity bias as a human will kind of edit out. So there are these 4 that work together. And then the final one I've already mentioned is that ability to rest back in your own sort of natural state, like not doing, by just paying attention to one simple thing and not chasing around. Yeah. So there are these 5 particular things that bring about this genuine well-being. And so how do you integrate them into what you see in your daily life? It's the same thing. You train in them on the cushion, and then you look for the opportunities to use them in the outside world.
Yeah. So it sounds like what you're trying to say is you have have that combination of the 2 different types, if I might, of happiness, and you apply it in your own lives. Obviously, when it's things that you need to do, you look for that, and there's your happiness. But at the same time, you embed your joy and your happiness in the daily simple things as well. Beyond what you need to do, what you have to do, you get to do other things, and that brings you happiness. So that's what I get from that.
That's right, and I could make it easier for you. No, that's exactly right. It's not as cleanly divisible as it sounds.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of a spectrum. So, like, I really like to go surfing, and I don't live far from the beach. I'm not especially good at it, but it really relaxes me, and that's a great example of both.
Yeah.
because there is this hedonic thing about the fun of surfing, but there is
Yeah.
an element to this of actually being out on my own, um,
Mm.
like in nature, out in the ocean, seeing the horizon and these sorts of things. And of course, if you have a mindfulness and certain practices, you can do them between sets. Like you can
Yeah.
actually sit on a surfboard and bring this
Yeah.
up. So there's often a mix, and there's
Yeah.
some really good examples of that. If I give my friend, and if I give a friend of mine a present,
Yeah.
um, this is a great example actually, and they don't seem very sort of pleased about it. This is really interesting
Oh
because
no.
it's like how invested was I? There's this mix, and so again, it's going to be a mix. I'm going to be maybe I'll be disappointed that they didn't like it. That's about me. That's the hedonic happiness I wanted from this.
Yeah.
But then there's also a sense of having just been generous and giving something
Yeah.
that feeds into the hedonic side. So it does take some thinking about and teasing apart because they will almost always be mixed in this way.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's very cool. Thank you for giving the examples. I think it's great to hear from the perspective of an expert, because in our daily lives we probably don't pay attention to whether it's hedonic happiness or genuine happiness. We might as sometimes we just package or call it as a feeling when
Yeah,
something
yeah,
happens, like, oh, I get paid, or I'm so happy, or like, oh, like I'm hanging out with my friends and I'm happy. But it's actually there's a lot that plays into that. So that's very interesting. And I think that is really an epiphany for me, because when we talk about happiness, there's so much that goes into it.
yeah.
And that is probably why a lot of people get happiness wrong. And there are definitely misconceptions out there. So, from your expertise, what are some of the misconceptions about happiness you've seen?
Yeah, right. This is so. There's we have a lot of problems in terms of stress and burnout and so forth in the society, and a lot of it is through mistaken ideas. And when I was younger, my instinct would be to shout down the people and shout at the people who I think might have it wrong, which I found isn't really as helpful. Which is why I kind of I'll bring it up now because you asked. But there's some I say this in a trying to be as gentle as possible because uh, this is going to there will be some people hear this who won't particularly like it. So I'm aware of that. But if you look at almost all of the advice around self-care, for example,
Yeah.
right? Like in this day and age, I don't think you'll find very much of it falls into the genuine side of things,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
So it's almost all hedonic, which is the nature of our society. I mean, that's realistically, we have a very consumer-driven society.
Yeah,
That's the way we
that's
operate,
true. Treat
and
yourself.
globally now, it's not just a Western thing, really.
Yeah.
So it gets problematic then that the idea of this idea of genuine, like actually you could reduce stress, right, by understanding how your attention is drawn to the hedonic and how you interpret the hedonic as genuine, and it never pays off. Whereas, there are these things you could take time to do that cultivate genuine happiness that don't sacrifice the hedonic. I mean, this isn't about never having ice cream or never having, it's not about that.
Yeah.
It's and so there are times when I'm just really stressed and I just need to drown it out, and I just watch bad TV or something. It's okay, like I
Yeah.
I don't
As
have a
we all
problem with
do.
that.
Yeah.
But I don't have an expectation it'll pay off. In fact, my expectation is it'll probably make it worse in the long run, but I'm
Yeah.
just too tired to care. So that happens to everyone. That's okay.
Yeah.
Um, but that if some of the self care advice that was out there for people started to think about how about this how happiness works, I think we'd get a lot more resilience out of our workforce, and especially out of really high pressure ones, high pressure workforces. And if so, I think that's a big part of it. If we started talking about it in this way, look, yeah, doing these sorts of things, it will help you and it'll take your mind off things, and that's great. But the best it will do is take you around the block, and you'll end up right where you started. So if that's your expectation, cool. Like that's actually there's a time for that, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
But when you flip over and start to look at, I don't want to dive too deep if you don't need to. But when you look into the causes of genuine happiness, then and compassion and kindness are these two real big ones that we hear all the time. And this is research driven. Okay, this of course there's a Buddhist and Christian, also has other backgrounds, but even from a research perspective, we know that compassion helps your mental health. Um, but then we misunderstand the causes even further. And so you have these terms like compassion fatigue. So I've already shot down negative emotions. I've kind of undermined the idea of happiness. So I'll just go after this as well while I'm here.
Yeah.
You've got compassion fatigue, and which I'm just going to go right out and say there's no such thing as compassion fatigue. What we get wrong is we mistake empathy for compassion. And our society and our language seems to do this, which is funny because if you look in the dictionary, empathy is like an intuitive understanding of another person's experience, right? There are different types of empathy, but we'll keep it simple. That's what we're mostly talking about. My understanding of your experience without you telling me. Compassion, again, straight out of the dictionary, is this aspiration or a wish that people not suffer. That's what it is. And so these are different. So if you say, for example, I deal with a lot of healthcare professionals and teachers. So healthcare professionals go from one suffering person to another, and they're drawn to the gig, to the work, because they have this empathic resonance with them. They feel the suffering. That's what drew them in. But if all you do is share in the suffering of one person after another, right, then and burnout it's a one-way ticket. But if you can actually combine that if you add this compassion training to it, that everything you do is done motivated by the wish to relieve the suffering, this aspiration, then actually you get, and again, research based, I'm not making this up, you get this release valve for the empathy.
Yeah.
So what we've got then is we've got compassion, we've got empathic distress is the term, and it's being called compassion fatigue. And so what we end up with is the solution to the problem being labeled as the cause of the problem. And I don't know, we could talk for a long time about the flow-on effect of that. But that's what, and so we've driven into this whole thing where in order to be compassionate, you need to get in and get involved, and then you have to get away and not think about it. But of course, you can't not think about it, because as soon as you get away, you start ruminating and thinking about it.
Yeah.
But if you had attention training, you could break that up. There's this whole matrix of things here that come together in a way that is very, very logical, and it's been known across the world for thousands of years. It's about time we sort of picked it up and had another look.
Yeah. So it sounds like there are quite a few layers of misconceptions when it comes to happiness, because happiness in itself involves a lot of other factors and things like, compassion, empathy that brings happiness as well in a way. And that, you were saying some misconceptions about compassion fatigue. And I feel like that could play into some of the misconceptions that people have about happiness. Like,
Yeah.
I'll be happy if I have compassion, and there's just no compassion fatigue involved. Something like that. It could be really simple, but then people sometimes don't realize. And yeah, it's totally true, because I feel like happiness is such a broad concept, and there's so many different layers and things that we need to learn about. And that's great that you pointed out something different today, compared to just the regular self-care and happiness that we generically call it. But about today, we really want to dive deep into negative emotions. So, how about negative emotions? How do you think negative emotions in particular affect our happiness?
Right. So let's have a look at. Let's have a look. Thanks for bringing it back, by the way. So let's have a look at this. And remember, when we're talking about negative emotions, we're talking about negative affect. We're talking about an unpleasant experience. We're not talking about an emotion that we would be better off without, right? Um, so let's say it's whether it's fear. I mean, the kind of big fear, sadness, and anger are the three big ones when you're talking about this. Then um, it's okay. There's nuance to these emotions. In fact, we call them emotion families, because there's different types of fear, there's different types of anger, there's different types of sadness as well. And so and I'll keep running with this then, if I'm presenting the split between genuine and hedonic, no one needs to train in hedonic happiness. It's pretty easy, right?
Yeah.
That's no worries.
Yeah.
All we need to do is know that it's hedonic and there's another type. So let's get interested
Yeah.
in that. So
Yeah.
I'm saying compassion is one of them. So in order to develop a wish that people not suffer, you need empathy. So that actually, it's not what you can do without it. You need the empathy to understand the experience. And then you need to develop on top of that this real genuine wish that the people or myself not experience it. And I'm presenting this as a cause of happiness. Now, people are probably thinking, well, that doesn't sound like any fun at all. I have to focus in on other people's suffering. And you're right, like it's not fun in and of itself. So in actual fact, it's a case where this so-called negative emotions, but negative affect, is something that you would actually bring on and experience, but with the understanding that you've got this, it's a springboard into this sort of eudaimonia, this genuine happiness, so that the negative affect doesn't always need to be like it's not always blowing up your happiness. There are actually times where it's a spring, it's something that you work through into cultivating genuine happiness. You don't need it for hedonic, of course. I don't need to go through any sort of anger and a thing to get hedonic happiness. I can just go, buy a pizza or something. It's okay. But this other side is different, and this is why we don't talk about. I don't use the term negative emotions unless I'm kind of debunking it, because there's a lot of use for that. And if your measure of your happiness is kind of right here and now, is like right here and now, am I enjoying myself or not? Then you should just stick with the hedonic. It won't turn out well. Do that. Whereas if your measure is, hey, look, overall, how are things going? Do I feel like am I contributing? How are my relationships? What all these other things that are going on for me? Then a little bit of this negative affect isn't going to get in the way of your happiness.
Mm. Yeah, I think that is really interesting to hear from your expertise and your expert lens, because a lot of the times when I talk to friends, for example, we would talk about how if we have no, let's say, negative emotions, we won't be able to feel the happiness, the true joy and happiness in life, because we won't be able to appreciate it as much. And what is happiness really? It's just really hard to explain and define. And obviously, I know that now that I've learned today, hedonic and genuine, but there's just so much that goes into it, and it's kind of like the ups and the downs in life. If you don't
Yeah,
go through the downs, how do you know that it's an up? How do you know that you're happy? So I think it's very interesting when you kind of unpack it in the scientific terms. um, yeah, it's definitely probably really different from what people would hear on a day-to-day basis. It's not something that we hear very often.
yeah, and it's funny because it is something that. Um, so there are people, and I've encountered a lot of them who just kind of felt like some sort of meditation or mindfulness training would help them through their stress, which is great, no worries, or stop smoking or whatever. Um, Great, and so they've done it, and then they've just discovered that they feel overall much better about everything, and they haven't questioned it. And then it's just, oh, mindfulness equals feeling better, which is kind of all right. I get way too interested in things to leave it at that. I want to know why. I mean,
Yeah.
enough that I'll move countries to find out. And
Yeah.
so but that's where it gets really interesting, because you can. It's like, I guess a good analogy would be this. So I like to keep fit. I swim laps. The uni has a really nice pool, so I go and swim laps
Yeah.
to keep fit. Um, I sort of swim a K and a half, maybe two, and I could probably swim more, but I don't. I just get out because that's enough. Because I'm not an athlete,
Yeah.
that helps. I could probably correct my stroke. I could probably get training to actually swim better and more efficiently. Yeah, but I don't, because I'm just trying to stay this fit, right? Um, Whereas if I really wanted to get really good at swimming, then I'd have a whole regime, and I'd know how strokes work and kicking works and all this sort of stuff. I'd know it all, and I'd be practicing it when I'm there.
Yeah.
And so it's the same thing here. It's kind of funny because now we've got this thing where I meditate for a bit. And it seems to make me happier. Cool. I'll just keep meditating a bit. And that's like me in the pool. No worries.
Yeah.
But just as I know that, actually, we have 2 or 3 gold medalists up here on the Sunshine Coast
Mm.
training in the squad here.
Yeah.
Just as I know that I could, maybe not win a gold medal, but I know that I could get better, but I don't. The same thing here is like, well, when you're meditating, you're feeling better. You could actually refine this if you want. And you could go for Olympic level well-being, or you could just go for, your local state champion well-being. I don't know. You could sort of decide
Yeah.
how you want it to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in order to do it, you'll have to sort of settle in and refine your understanding and your technique and correct some things to go. And so you have this whole spectrum then of people who are just trying to feel better and it's okay, through to people who are really interested in in really high levels of well-being and what would drive it. And so that's, coming back to what you were saying about how there is, we need the unpleasant experiences to enjoy the pleasant experiences. While that's true, you're still talking on the level of hedonic sort of well-being.
Yeah.
So once you switch out of that into this sort of sense of a broader scope of well-being, you can train to get really high levels of let's say mental health.
Yeah. That's very interesting. There's a lot to unpack here, I think.
There is a lot.
Yeah, and it seems like the more we unpack it, the more we learn about the little details. And I know that you did mention this earlier, but I want to dig deeper a little bit into it. So you said negative emotions, fear, sadness, anger. How about we go a little bit deeper into that? What else is included here? And if you were to categorize them and to help people unpack their negative emotions, how would you go about that?
Yeah, that's a really good way of approaching it, actually. I the So the best way, perhaps, in such a short period of time, would be, let's just take one. Let's take fear, for example. So overall, fear is so a lot of these emotions are related to disorders. So in this case, we're talking about anxiety. Fear
Yeah.
is the emotion that's related to the mood disorder, anxiety. But there are different types of fear that really change the experience. So, for example, and in fact, in terms of fear, there's three. So let's have a look at that. Firstly, we call it a trigger, or in psychology, we call it an elicitor, something that brings the emotion about.
Yeah.
And in fear, you always have a theme. So in terms of fear, the trigger theme is some kind of threat.
Yeah.
Perceived. Remember, it doesn't have to even exist.
Yeah.
But if I'm afraid of dogs and I see a pile of rocks over there that I think is a dog, right, that's all I need. I can remember a time I saw a dog and be triggered. So it's so fear. So there are three things that kind of determine the type of fear. The first one is a coping mechanism. Do I or do I not have a coping mechanism? That really changes things.
Yeah.
Because then the fear becomes a sense of arousal that helps you just dive in and get it done. Whereas if you don't think you have a coping mechanism, you've got panic probability. There's some, like the experience is very different.
Yeah.
There's the difference between sudden onset fear versus impending. Something that happens in fact, this is really interesting because something that happens quite quickly. So you have surfing's always an example for me. Something pops out of nowhere and bigger waves pop out of nowhere and you're unexpected or something like this. Then it sort of tends to be a reflex action. And in fact, it's analgesic. It tends to dial down types of pain.
Yeah.
Whereas impending fear is the opposite. If you have something I know I need to do tomorrow, actually it's anti-analgesic or whatever that would be. You're more sensitive to pain and worry and so on. What have I said? Coping, onset, and intensity, of course. That's true for all emotions. The degree of perceived threat. So you can see when we say fear, you've already got this huge array of different possible experiences.
Yeah.
And when I present fear, I have a couple of great photos I use as slides. We've got two people on a roller coaster.
Yeah.
And you got this person terrified, and it's very, very clear. You have the person next to them smiling and holding their hand is my favorite one.
Yeah.
And so you've got the same emotional trigger. And it's really interesting. So fear drives us. We want to escape. Blood rushes to our legs to help us escape. And you see these, we shrink. It just becomes about me and my fear.
Yeah.
And the facial expression, tone of voice, they all signal to others. But really, it's about me. Whereas an enjoyable emotion, so the person sitting next to me, that opens us up. We like to connect with people. So enjoyable emotions are really important. They build, their cohesive social bonds and so on. So I love this photo. We've got this person who's loving it so much, she's decided to comfort her friend who couldn't care less because she's so terrified. And it's the same it's the same trigger, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
And different experiences. So, if you start to unpack how these emotions work, well, in terms of this, what if we could find you coping mechanisms for a fear that you currently don't have coping mechanisms for? That is it's a new way, it's a different way of thinking about it. It's not about kind of ignoring the problem on my days off or anything like this. It's about turning towards the problem and saying, why can't I cope and what would I need? Which takes a third party to help you usually. And when you give them that, then bam, you've changed. It's still fear, but now it's not so much what's the term? Instead of sort of dragging you down and debilitating, it's kind of arousal and gets you going,
Yeah.
sort of into it. So that's just one example for fear. You can do the same for different types of
Yes.
sadness, anger,
Absolutely.
so on.
Yeah. That's just a really nice way to unpack it and to really dig deeper into different kinds of we call negative emotions. So one interesting thing that has kind of resurfaced, thanks to what you just mentioned, is because there's just different kinds of negative emotions, and within each kind of negative emotion, there are different aspects to them. We constantly deal with negative emotions in life. And I know you've touched on this a little bit, but here's the golden question. Should we just stop and prevent negative emotions altogether? Do we, and if so, how? If not, how do we overcome them? So there's quite a few things happening here, because a lot of people want to avoid them altogether,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, there are people that accept as they come, and they really want to overcome these negative emotions.
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts on this?
It's funny because it's such an important question, and it's actually not that hard to
Yeah.
answer,
Yeah. Okay.
believe it or not.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Great.
so something like fear that people consider negative, so as a negative emotion, there are instances, several. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot. There's a few documented that we learn about in psychological examples, where a calcified amygdala has meant a person doesn't experience fear, so there's a neural problem,
Yeah.
and they don't experience fear. These people cannot be left alone, right? They're not afraid of snakes, they're not afraid of cliffs, they're not afraid of bad neighborhoods, guns, they're not afraid of anything. So they actually can't, you can't go anywhere alone,
Yeah.
literally.
Mm.
You know, I mean, literally, there's, your toast is stuck in a toaster, just grab a knife. And there's nothing, right? There's no time they're not at threat.
Yeah.
And that's because fear is so important. If someone cuts you off on the highway while you're driving, fear will save your life and the lives of the other people. If a child runs out in front of your car, that's fear that will drive a response to
Yeah.
stop them. So actually, we need them.
Yeah.
So the issue is not to level the playing field. Stop talking about, and because remember, if there's no negative emotions, there's also no positive emotions,
Yeah. Absolutely.
right? So I mean, if you've got I don't know, if you have a heroin addict, and they're saying, oh yeah, I just want enjoyable emotions. Well, there's an easy way to help them, or an alcoholic, but it's not, it's going to help them get the enjoyable emotions, but overall it's going to cause harm. So there's just level the playing field and think emotions are signposts. They're signposts. You're only emotional because something you think important is happening, right? That's part of the definition of emotions here. And so see them as signposts. It's like fear. Oh, that's interesting. What am I afraid of? Do I have a coping mechanism? Right? Or I'm sad. Oh, what's that about? And so in this case, you say, oh, oh, I'm afraid. That's interesting. I'm feeling under threat. Is it a physical threat or an emotional threat? Because you actually experience them the same, sociological threat versus,
Yeah.
um, do I experience them the same? And then you can reason your way through it. And you can do that in less than a second. This doesn't, we're very, very fast. You can
Yeah.
do that very, very quickly, especially if you train to do it, especially if you have a mindfulness training. If I keep pushing it back,
Yeah.
so in actual fact, to start to see emotion as a signpost that tells me something important is going on, and then I go ahead and I have some way of using that information to spring forward, then what you have is you have your emotions working for you, no matter what, whether it's fear or anger or anything. Anger is a great example. I don't know if you, uh, anger is a great example that actually, it gets people off the couch. Like anger got women the vote. Anger ended slavery. Anger has done these massive things,
Yeah.
right? But they
Absolutely.
got done because people got angry and they thought about what to do next, right? And then
Yeah.
they did the smartest thing. So yeah, I would, and then you can finish this whole thing up by people who want to get rid of emotions. You just can't anyway. You can't get rid
Yeah.
of emotions.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Because yeah, I think this is something that people are constantly learning. For some people, it's just hard to feel any emotions, especially negative emotions. So they just want to like avoid these emotions altogether. But however, like you said, I think you covered a lot of grounds within just that one answer. We need negative emotions. Otherwise, there's also just no positive emotions. And obviously, negative emotions, they are unpleasant to feel, but they help us in our lives to move forward. We know
Yep.
what's better, we know what's next. And yeah, and in essence, you learn to deal with it. And that is probably how you already kind of wrapped up this segment for us within just one answer. It's so amazing. Thank you.
No worries. I mean, I can tell you why I got really interested in this because my
Yeah.
first profession was my first degree was a music performance, a jazz performance degree when I
Yeah.
lived in Canada. And it would be interesting because often you'd sit on a gig and you might not have even met half the band, like you don't really know what's going to happen. And so there's this nervousness. And what I noticed is that when I'd sit down and I wasn't nervous, I'd be worried. Like if I was nervous, you'd know that you were going to pull it off.
Yeah.
But if I sat down all confident, I think so. Then the confidence would get me worried because I'd think, "What's happening?" And that idea of the fear of messing up publicly was actually really helpful if you knew how to use it.
Yeah.
And that's where this comes in. Do I have a coping mechanism? How do I treat this? And if you can give people these coping mechanisms, then you can deal with you can use fear. If
Mm,
you people understand how anger works and they have the mindfulness training to not just have these knee-jerk reactions,
mm.
then you can turn anger responses into something intelligent and stay calm and reason your way through things.
Yeah. And I
There's
reckon there's a way to deal with each of these emotions, backed by
Yeah, that's
research,
right.
of course. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. So how would listeners go about finding about that? Because I would reckon, so you were giving an example of anger. There's another example that you gave on fear. So there are different ways and different things. There's just a lot of layers here. How would people go about dealing with their negative emotions as they come, including, fear, anger, and so on?
Yeah, well, I would look into firstly the idea of coping is really important. Um, so is it it's hard with emotions. One of the things we tend to do with the emotional triggers is we overestimate them.
Yeah.
So, this program that I often work with is called Cultivating Emotional Balance.
Mm,
And emotional balance is the appropriate emotion at the appropriate intensity at the appropriate time. So like that's what we're looking at. And so a lot of overreactions, most people come to me because they're overreacting
yeah.
one way or another. And those
Yeah.
overreactions are from overestimating the trigger. I
Mm,
overestimate the threat of the presentation I have to give, or the dog down the street, or whatever it might be in fear. I overestimate the anger trigger. I think that they're more of an obstruction than I think they are, or sadness, and so on.
yeah.
So yeah, this is the way to sort of like you're really driving at the root now of balancing your emotions if you think of them in this way. And so how you go about it, of course, if you emotions rely on the attentional capture. So the trigger captures my attention. Now everything's automatic. I don't really think things through. And what the mindfulness or attention training does is help you notice when your attention is captured and bring it back.
Yeah.
And if you can bring it back on the cushion, you'll be able to bring it back when you're emotional. And then you actually have control over your reactions.
Yeah.
So you want to think about, I mean, when I work with clients, we figure out the ones that are most problematic and we come up with plans, we write them down.
Yeah.
So the next time that happens, hopefully you'll pull off your new plan, which it may or may not work, but at least you're going to change
Yeah.
it up.
You're prepared.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like this. So they're the sorts of things to do, is to sort of write down, figure out how you would like to operate differently.
Yeah.
Find some
Absolutely.
effective mindfulness training and
Yeah.
relaxation training,
Mm.
and get to it from there. I mean, I put a few things on my website that I just put up there for free about negative emotions, mindfulness training, and compassion, because so many people were coming to me, and I was spending all my time answering them with emails. I thought it'd be quicker if I just recorded something
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
put it out there. But
Yeah.
of course, the trouble is, it's if you're going to think like this and operate in this way, you have to kind of, I guess it does take some commitment, because the rest of the world is still trying to get rid of their negative emotions,
Yeah.
and you're over here trying to use it,
Yeah.
and it makes it hard to talk to everyone.
Yeah, definitely. But it will spark a lot of interesting conversations, I think, because this is important. It's not
Yeah,
about avoidance, it's about learning to deal with what's gonna come, because negative emotions are gonna come.
yeah.
I don't think we'll ever get away with, not having anything or not feeling anything negative at all. It's just impossible.
That's right. And you think again, because this attention component is so big, if I'm afraid of public speaking and someone tells me I have to give a presentation tomorrow, then or even next week, right? Then as long as I'm paying attention to that possibility, I'm going to have all this worry. And if I just treat that as, if I don't have a coping mechanism, I'm not going to get anything done.
Yeah.
Whereas if I can look ahead and think, oh well, I've got time to prepare, I've got, I can develop a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
Then now I can start to piece things together. You'll still be afraid, you'll still be nervous. It's okay, but that you'll be able to kind of use it, if you like, to push through.
Yeah.
Otherwise, and so the point being that if at first it's like this, if you're afraid of public speaking and someone gives you a gig, or gives you a presentation you have to do, uh, as long as you're attending to it, you're going to be all caught up and worried. And you can actually just turn your attention away, find the breath in your body,
Yeah.
find a cookie. It doesn't matter. Once your attention is away from the trigger, you won't be emotional.
Yeah.
So the next step from there is as I noticed that I'm becoming emotional, rather than stay sucked into the trigger and focusing on that, that's the springboard, that's the signpost that makes me think, oh, what do I do about this? And that's what emotions don't do. Like, you're fighting evolution here. What evolution has done
Yeah.
for us is, okay, stay focused on the trigger and deal with that.
Yep.
But in actual fact, if you can do a bit of training, then you say, oh, you have this trigger and I'm feeling emotional. Now I take that and I think, what do I do to get through this? I start
Yeah.
problem solving.
Yep.
And if you look at
Problem solving.
mental health and psychology, the difference between the way we interact, we've got a real problem with, say, ending up with something that's called a disorder versus not, is whether or not is the amount of problem solving we have at the time. And that can prevent anxiety, prevent depression, for example, just
Yeah.
by problem solving our way through. But you've got to fight against thousands of generations of evolution, which takes a little bit of time.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I just love how you touched on problem solving and all of that when it comes to emotions, because yes, we can definitely do that and it's going to
Yeah.
help us massively. Instead of just reacting, we're problem solving. Let's think of it that way. And that will take it up a notch and it will become much more positive.
The evidence is actually that's what emotions are actually for,
Yeah.
is to draw our attention, give us the arousal, and help us solve our way through. It's
Amazing.
just,
Yeah.
our environment's changed so quickly, and our nervous system hasn't, that we're
Yeah.
operating with hunter-gatherer nervous system in the 21st century, and it's
Yeah.
now it's a bit problematic. We have to undo
Yeah.
some of that.
Ah, very interesting. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights on negative emotions. We have unpacked a lot. We have unpacked your definitions, different kinds of negative emotions, how we deal with it, how important it is to us in our lives, actually, compared to what people would think, because it's a taboo topic, negative emotions. It has the
Yeah,
word negative in it. It's supposed to be bad. You know, not really if we learn how to deal with it. So
that's right.
thank you for that. That was really awesome. And now we have this really fun segment where we switch roles. So you'll be interviewing me. You'll be the host of this for the next 2 to 5 minutes, depending on how much you want to ask. Feel free to ask me anything you want about the same topic.
About the topic, okay. Um, I'd be curious. Firstly, let's have a look at this split of hedonic versus genuine.
Yeah.
Sort of, how do you feel about that? Does it seem clear? How do you?
I think to me, it started to make sense when you gave examples, but I feel like it would take a lot of learning because this is so new. It's new information, so there will definitely be a process of me uncovering the difference and the clear kind of divide between them, because sometimes I feel like maybe I'm mixing them together, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I might be talking about hedonic, but I thought it's genuine. So I feel like it's a learning curve. It might take a bit of time to adjust, and I have to do my homework after today as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Definitely look
Well,
into it.
then I guess it would be like, and so I'm not asking for an example.
Yeah,
It's a question I've asked a lot over the years.
yeah,
Is, can you think of, and again, I'm not asking for an example, but can you think of a time, and everyone who's watching, I guess, can you think
yeah.
of a time or times where you might have mistaken hedonic for genuine?
Mm,
So for a time, to say that you went after something that's sort of just, resource driven, you have to grab. with
Yeah.
the sort of idea that it's going to have this long-term payoff.
Oh, I think maybe it's so clear. Maybe it's kind of like, when you were probably a bit younger and you're kind of like, oh, I have my first paycheck. I'm going to reward myself with a new computer. And this is like such an achievement. It brings me joy and happiness because it's like a sense of achievement. But then at the same time, it's just hedonic because I need that computer anyway. I feel like that's probably the closest thing I can think of for now.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's an interesting question to have with people to think. Oh, um, so
Hmm.
do you think then? Because what about, say, I'm just curious about this genuine hedonic split,
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
course the circles I move in are a little bit constrained, I guess.
Yeah.
Say in a corporate world, a corporate setting, which you would have more experience than me,
Yeah.
um, how do you think it would be received?
That is such a good question. I think it's probably like because the work that we do in the corporate setting is really task driven,
Mm,
and when you feel like you've completed the task and the project, you feel a sense of achievement and you feel like that's genuine happiness, but actually that's just hedonic because you need to finish that anyway. So I
hmm.
feel like that's my interpretation from what you've told me today. Um, but then again, there might be more layers to that because, yeah, it's hard to think on the spot, but that's the closest thing I could think of because just lots of tasks, lots of things to do every day, and then yeah, when you finish, you're like, oh my god, I'm so happy about this. I'm really happy that the team is doing this, or I'm really happy that the project's going that way.
Yeah,
But that's probably just hedonics, not really genuine happiness.
yeah, yeah. Then do you think? How about like, do you think it's going to be problematic from a profit point of view? This is we're talking here about a bit of a cultural shift, perhaps.
Yeah.
Um, is if you start telling CEOs that actually there's this type of well-being that we could all have that doesn't cost anything, and doesn't necessarily need products for. Do you think
Oh,
it's something that might be embraced, or?
that's gonna be really tricky. And no, I think we should not go that way. Definitely not. Um, yeah, I think what I am think have been thinking about a lot as well because well-being, happiness in the workplace definitely something I'm really passionate about,
Yeah.
and I feel like yep, a sense of achievement brings you joy and happiness as a team, and that's hedonic, but we also need genuine happiness. So connection between people, just the enjoyment of, enjoying working with other people, enjoying collaborating with your colleagues, having a team culture, really celebrate each other's special events like birthdays, engagement, whatever it might be that's outside of work that would bring a lot of happiness and joy to the workplace. And
Mhm.
again, I'm still learning about this. Hopefully, chief happiness officer is one of the roles that I really want to definitely do one day. So,
Yeah, right.
that's very interesting, right? Um, yeah, but yeah, definitely learning a lot from the conversation we have today, so that I can kind of take a step back and really evaluate how I've been seeing it and observing it in the corporate world.
You gave a really good example. If I'd like to just really just quickly address, because this is really helpful in this hedonic genuine split,
Yeah,
is say a team that pulls together and achieves something together, and you celebrate that, is a really good example of how you use the whole thing,
yeah,
because there's this hedonic, having achieved something and whatever, it's very hedonic, but as I mentioned before, the enjoyable emotions open us up,
yeah,
like they cement those social bonds, which
yeah,
is really important. So it's
yeah,
quite important. At the same time, the sense of like looking at other people and kind of, what's the word, maybe rejoicing, or being like really noticing and feeling good about their achievements,
mm,
this is genuine.
yeah,
So you've got this, it's a great example of where you can
mm,
mix into the culture a
yeah,
combination of both, and in a way that really works. It's not this just goofy sort of hedonic happiness that's kind of everyone's going to forget about. Like, it's a really deep-seated sense of connection with other people, and
yeah,
then you combine that with the admiration for the work they've done.
yeah,
You've got the sort of, you've got it working together, in that situation. It's a great example of workplace well-being, in my opinion.
yeah. That's amazing. Thank you. I really love that. I would definitely ponder on that some more after today. Cool. All right. So now let's do open mic. This is going to be very fun because
Ooh.
we've talked a lot about happiness, negative emotions, but I'm sure you are passionate about other things as well. So what is the one thing that have been on your mind lately that you really want to share with listeners?
I'll try to break away from what we're talking about. It's pretty all-encompassing though,
Yeah.
and there's a lot.
Yeah.
I would, um, you know what, I would say it's the sort of tech giant, the social media kind of problem that we have at the moment, and I would really encourage people to sort of understand just how the social media sort of landscape is working for us, because and then again, I'm not really big on this idea of things as being good or bad. There's a lot of potential, even for Facebook and Instagram and these, but we don't necessarily understand that there's this profit motive that's driving what we're seeing on this, and that what it's sort of this attention economy that's sort of really pulling into our attention, and
Mm,
that the thing that gets the most attention are often the things that polarize us and drive us apart
that's
the
so
most.
true.
And so there's this great quotation, I think, that's like, we have, I forget who it is. It's from Tristan Harris, I heard it from, but he's quoting someone else. It's like, we have
Yeah.
Neanderthal emotions and sort of like, medieval institutions, but we've got this godlike technology pointed right at our brains.
Yeah.
And we're not evolved enough, to sort of resist it naturally. So I
Yeah.
think one thing that I would really kind of love to see people doing is perhaps really taking control of a news feed. And I mean, like, I did it once. I mean, you don't have to be this extreme, but I unfollowed everyone. I did this years ago, and it was great. Like, there was no sort of useless information there, and then I just very selectively um, brought people and organizations back in that I was interested in.
Yeah.
And so that it would be something I'd really encourage people to have a look at, is the social media, the use, how it works, and how it's sort of really warping our attention. It's sort of causing wars, influencing elections. There's a lot going on, and
Yeah.
it's not because there's a big bad man out there or men out there in oak panel rooms
Yeah.
deciding to do it.
Yeah.
It's because they make the most, or their shareholders make the most money if you stay on the phone or
Yeah.
the device. So
Absolutely.
yeah, perhaps maybe organizing with friends and family. So something I've done in the past is a Monday or a Monday morning or something, a period of time where everyone's off.
Yeah.
No one has a device, leaving your devices at home,
Yeah.
and really freeing yourself up, because um, it is causing us some problem, and it really needs to be addressed. It's the issue of our time, that
Yeah.
fixing that will help us fix environmental problems. It'll help fix polarization and social problems as well. So
Mm.
yes, that that'll be,
Perfect.
without going into a big
Perfect.
rant. That's what it'll do.
Yeah. No, it's a great rant. I love that. Yeah, it's definitely much needed nowadays because how often do you actually break away from your phone, especially when you're, with your family and friends? Do
Yeah,
you
that's
actually
right.
not have your phone with you? Because I feel like for me as well, it's a trap. Like, oh, I have to show you something. This is really cool. Reach for my phone first thing.
Yeah,
Have nothing else to say. Reach for my phone and show them something cool. So having a conversation with no phone, that would be a real good challenge. I would really love to do that as well. So thank you for sharing that. Well, Corey, that's it for today. And hopefully you had a good time chatting about the topic of negative emotions in the context of happiness. I've definitely learned a lot, and I hope listeners have learned a lot as well. Thank you for sharing your work, and hopefully listeners will go and check out your website, your work, and we'll hopefully have you back in the future as a guest.
yeah, sure thing. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all the work you're doing. It's we need a lot of momentum really to make some big changes. So thank you for what you're up to as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you next time.
Okay.
You've been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast, produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at haluno.com. www.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.